Hello and welcome to the Aiken County Soil and Water Conservation District podcast. Our goal is to provide another way for people to connect to the district's priorities and programs and to make the watershed and its issues come alive. Today we're going to talk to Dr. Alec Lackmann from the University of Minnesota Duluth. He's an expert of the Bigmouth buffalo, which is an incredible yet understudied native fish species that can live to be over 100 years old. Dr. Lackmann studied them right here at the Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge, and as he'll tell us, they face a lot of challenges in the county. They haven't successfully reproduced since the 1950s, and combined with unlimited harvesting, their population might not be sustainable for much longer. There's still time, though, to give them the same protections that we afford to many other fish, and to keep studying them to make sure that this species can thrive for years to come. Alec, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Alec Lackmann. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and I do a lot of research. I'm a fish researcher, ichthyologist, someone who studies fish. And yeah, today we're going to talk about some work that is ongoing and also some work that we recently published regarding bigmouth buffalo, a species of fish found here in Minnesota that's native to the state. Some work about this big fish species that many people don't know about. We just published some work about them a few weeks ago, actually, in early September.
Yeah, I saw your article. So if you mind giving us like a general overview of the study and like kind of what happened and in broad strokes, kind of what you found.
Yeah, so just to begin, how this all ties back to the Aiken County Soil and Water Conservation District is that back in, I think it was fall of 2019, I'd received an email from Sam Seybold, who is the buffer specialist there at the district there. And he had seen some media, I think it was, following our publication that we on bigmouth buffalo in 2019, where we first found and documented their incredible longevity. Because before 2019, it was thought that this species, the bigmouth buffalo, was only living about 10 to 20 years in the wild and reproduced really consistently, and there really wasn't much to learn about them. What we found in that 2019 paper that they can live more than 100 years in Minnesota, and we also carbon dated the structures for aging to validate and test the validity of the ages, like showing conclusively that they lived through the nuclear bomb testing that occurred in the 50s and 60s. So there was a lot of, I think, interest in that work because it was the first to really define and understand really the life history of this species, sort of the natural biology of bigmouth buffalo in terms of how do they live, what is their life pace. And then Sam had seen some of that and he had reached out and had mentioned that he had long also been fascinated by bigmouth buffalo because he had long been going to Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge that's just south of McGregor there to observe and interact with the bigmouth buffalo migration that he had noticed all the way back to like 1986 as a kid. And for many years since, he was going there and observing them and he was always so fascinated. So he had reached out mentioning this site and had also invited me to potentially present at the Aiken County fair, one of the Lakes and Water fairs that summer. And things just went from there and eventually came out to make a site visit and to meet Sam and everything, and really became fascinated with this system in the Rice River and Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge.
Yeah, so I guess about the buffalo fish, it has a pretty wide range. Am I wrong about that? And so why would you decide to study the Rice Lake population or Rice River population in particular?
Yeah, so you're correct. The bigmouth buffalo does have a pretty wide latitudinal range. They're found all the way up into southern Saskatchewan. So they go up into the Red River Basin up there. They're also found all the way down to Louisiana in the Mississippi Basin. But their range has been contracting in the northern part of their range. So in Canada, North Dakota, and Minnesota, since the 1970s, it's been documented that the bigmouth buffalo is declining, largely due to range, or as evidenced through range contraction, which means they're basically not as evident as they used to be in different sites. So Minnesota, North Dakota, Canada, they're definitely three main areas that are of concern for study just from a basic standpoint, understanding that. And I had already studied bigmouth buffalo, and we published that study in 2019, which was based from northwestern Minnesota. Really, most of the work was from northwestern Minnesota in that study, also some in southern Minnesota. But this location in Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge was obviously in more eastern Minnesota, east central Minnesota. So it presented an opportunity to take a look at a site that's in a different location, different watershed, and to learn more about this species. And then upon making the first site visit there, it became clear that and reading about it too before even going there, that it's been long documented that the bigmouth buffalo migrate the Rice River to go to Rice Lake to spawn. So there's this fascinating bigmouth buffalo migration that's occurring year after year. And there's these points along the Rice River that one can observe this incredible migration. So there's all sorts of different questions that one could investigate. For example, then this was totally unknown about this species too before this recent study we published is, for example, what is their spawning pace like? Do males and females arrive together? Do males arrive first? Do females leave first? Do males stay later? Do they all just arrive at the same time, leave at the same time together? And also, how long does the spawn last year after year? Is it variable? Lots of different questions to investigate. So it was clear pretty early on that this could be a really valuable study system.
So wait, so you said there was a migration, and maybe if you're a fish researcher, you can kind of think about it differently. But for me, I don't know that much about fish, and it's easy to kind of imagine that if you see a fish in like a particular river or a particular lake, to think like, oh, that's kind of where they live and that's where they always are. But you're saying that there's this really big migration
Yeah, no,
come together at Rice Lake, right? So do you know where they go the rest of the year? Do we know how far these fish are migrating or where they're migrating from? Or is that kind of
yeah, that's an excellent question as well, because, and this is something we point out in the discussion of the paper as well, that it's not known precisely where they're coming from. So it is known very well that they're migrating through the Rice River in the spring each year to make it to Rice Lake to spawn. And then shortly after spawning, they depart and leave, and they're not evident there through pretty much the rest of the year. But there's some main line of thinking is that they're likely coming from the Mississippi River, like actually coming from closer to Aiken, the
okay?
town of Aiken itself, navigating the 96 or 92-kilometer tributary of Rice River and making it into Rice Lake, spawning and then leaving. So these fish are likely traveling, yeah, quite a distance to get there and then leaving. But it's not known if, say, maybe some of them are actually coming from some of the connected lakes that lead into there as well. But I think probably the leading hypothesis is that they're coming from the main stem of the Mississippi River. At least that's what many have proposed, especially talking with anglers and others at the site. But yeah, it just hasn't been studied. It hasn't been figured out yet. And that's another thing that, as a future line of research, which we might get into later, is that someone could study this fish at this site and like capture a bunch with nets, for example, tag a bunch, release them, and then track them year after year to see, okay, where are they? Like you set up receivers and things downstream, figure out where they're going, where they're coming from, and how often are individuals coming back. Because another fascinating thing about this species is we still do not know if an individual female can spawn in back-to-back years. Because if a female spawns, it might take that female a few years or a couple years before it can regenerate those ovaries, much like sturgeon. If sturgeon female cannot spawn every single year and back to back to back to back years, they have to go years in between. But by doing such a tagging study, not only could we figure out where are they coming from, we could also figure out how often are females coming back and spawning. It would be incredible, for example, if with bigmouth buffalo, they can spawn every single year, like individuals coming back year after year after year, in combination with their incredible lifespan, because then you have a species that could potentially spawn like more than 100 times. Like an individual could spawn potentially more than 100 times across its lifespan, which is it could be pretty interesting if that is the case. But again, it could be that they have to go every other year. or every um, 3 years or something. It's just another area we don't know definitively.
Okay, yeah. So just to take a step back, so far we have this fish that can live to be over 100 years old that does this, migration to some spawning grounds and has to actually wait, possibly, we don't know, but it potentially has to wait like a few years to spawn again, depending on the level of detail you want to go into. Why would that be a good reproductive strategy for a fish?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, getting at like the evolutionary history and how something like this could be naturally selected over evolutionary time. And I think we can learn a lot from species like sturgeon and paddlefish, which are already pretty well understood. They have really long lifespans. They have similar migratory tendencies in the spring for spawning. And basically that you have these species that within a given population in any given year, some individuals could be spawning. So there still is that, there's still potentially enough of the population that's staggered across different years that you're having still this effect of every single year, you're at least seeing some. You have this really long lifespan, though, like we know with the bigmouth buffalo, this is something that's evolved as an adaptation to these challenging freshwater environments that they're found in. So basically, it speaks to the variability that's found in freshwater systems. So we know that like in the refuge too, like some of these habitats are prone to winter kill. There's environmental conditions that could wipe out a lot of them naturally, like or historically. There's also conditions with predation and other things that are likely limiting their ability to successfully survive after the young are spawned. So basically, the species has evolved this really long lifespan as a means to bridge those periods that can be unfavorable, so that they can live to that next time that's really good conditions where sort of everything lines up, and then there's another cohort that makes it through, and they could be the next generation that lasts for another 100 years. So they have this really unique and remarkable strategy of bet hedging. So they're not it's different, but in its own way, it's successful as long as the adults are able to persist and be there to year after year, be ready. This could be the year. This could be the year.
Okay, yeah.
This could be the year. And it also speaks to their style too. They're not like a panfish or a crappie or a bass or something where they release the eggs in there and there's parental care. There's no parental care in this species. They're broadcast spawners and their size is extremely small. They're investing so little per egg. These offspring are incredibly vulnerable at the point of the eggs being deposited and also at the point of hatch. Literally, they're the size of a grain of rice when they first hatch out. They're translucent and transparent, and even things like water mites and hydra can eat them. So they start from very simple beginnings and have to make it through this vast predation gauntlet. But if they can make it through that, they could potentially live a very long time as an adult.
Okay. So you just talked about, how that life history strategy kind of lets them get these populations that are really old in case they have trouble reproducing successfully. So that's a really good transition to talking about what you found in this paper that you just recently published about Rice Lake. So can you tell like what you found out about this, the condition of buffalo fish in this part of Aiken County?
Yeah, so it's incredible. This population that's migrating the Rice River, going to Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge every single year, even though they're spawning annually, every single year, there hasn't been a major successful recruitment event since the mid 1950s. And actually, if you look at the age structure of the data, it's really the 1940s and a little blip in the early 1950s that really basically make up the vast majority of this population. So here you have one of the oldest populations of vertebrate in the world, right here in Aiken County. They have an average age of 78 as of 2024, a median age of 79. The middle 50% of the age distributions from like 72 to 82 years. The modal age is 82 years as of 2024. So that's the most common age, over 80 in this population. It's incredible because there's nothing else like it. And it's right here in Aiken
Yeah.
County, and they're migrating there and they're visible. Like they're charismatic mega fish that people, maybe have long cast aside or written off as rough fish. and thought of them as inconsequential and of no use, of no matter or whatever. But these are native members of the ecosystem. They're co-inhabitants of the refuge and of Rice River and of Aiken County. And we're finding that they actually there's a lot we still don't understand about the big roles they play in nutrient dynamics and ecosystem services, like with all the offspring that they produce and then are eaten, that northern pike and the bluegill and the crappie and other predatory fish species that key in on this amazing resource. Like it's definitely an area that needs more study, but it's, yeah, one of the oldest populations of animal that we know of, with more than 99% of the current population having hatched before 1972.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about a population of animal that's, all of them are about as old as my grandparent. It's kind of unbelievable to think about. And
It
it's just,
really is.
yeah. So can you talk a little bit about how you found that out? Just because I think for some people, like this is pretty amazing, but how do you even go about measuring the age of like a fish population?
Yeah, so this gets back to that, really gets back to the work that we did in that 2019 paper where we demonstrated the value of the otoliths. So these are the ear stones within the fish. These are structures that are part of their inner ear system. But in order to age fish accurately, you have to use these structures to figure that out, because they're the only part of the fish that continues to grow continuously throughout its life. So we also validated that structure, like I said, using carbon dating or bomb radiocarbon dating in that 2019 paper, literally proving that the carbon material in the otolith was put down before, during, and after the bomb pulse throughout the growth profile of an individual and across individuals, literally showing that they lived through the nuclear bomb testing in the 50s and 60s, which more than doubled the amount of radiocarbon in the atmosphere and got into the organisms alive at the time. But basically, like, so in Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge, no one can, it's off limits to be targeting these fish in the lake itself. That's that's close to all forms of fishing. But at the water control structure and at other sites along the river that lead up to that, it's open to fishing. And for many decades, the pinch point that the water control structures created, the narrowing of the river, it has attracted anglers for many decades now since they were built. So then it's like working with the angler community to basically be there and then use the fish more for understanding more about the population. So that's how I end up taking the data and the measurements and all that stuff, and then figuring out the age of the fish. But they're really it's really a tedious process that requires a lot of work, and it takes a lot of detail. So
Right. I mean, I saw the pictures in the paper, in the study that you published, and it's basically, for listeners who haven't read it, it's like these incredible cross sections of his bone, and the rings are just packed so close together, and I can't even imagine how much time it took to count them all because
yeah, so
like over.
yeah, and one thing that's, I mean, yeah, one thing, the time invested to count it all, yeah, that's one thing, but it's even more to prep to do the otolith preparation work, because you have to, in order to section, because you can't just read these structures whole. It's like, imagine looking at the base of a tree and you want to figure out how old the tree is. Well, you'd have to take a core or a cross section from the trunk to figure that out. So with these otoliths, because they're so small, like one otolith from like an 80-year-old individual is not even bigger than a standard like pea in a pea pod. So they're really just this small little, like a size of a pencil eraser. And that has to be embedded in epoxy first, so that you can then have something to grip in the chuck of the low speed saw. So then you can slice it down the primary growth axis. And then you have to view that thin section on a compound microscope. You literally have light coming through the specimen. And then you're able to photograph it and quantify the rings. And yeah, but when you have that level of magnification with a compound microscope, in photography, you can get that level of detail that you need. But yeah, the way that they grow, it's kind of like a clamshell, some one of the otolith types. It just keeps arcing and growing as they age. But those annual rings, instead of being like in a tree, maybe a half centimeter or so apart, It's like these are microns apart, and you have to use microscopy.
Said you kind of worked with the anglers there because, I'm pretty sure a fish wouldn't survive you taking the otolith out of its head. So
Yeah, and that is one drawback with the otolith is it's a lethal structure. But to obtain and understand that accurate age data is really valuable, and then it can set a baseline for future reference. But there are other structures that had been investigated in the past, like fin rays and scales, which are non-lethal. You can pull a scale off a fish, for example, and try to age that. But the problem with those structures is they stop growing essentially once the fish stops growing to a large degree. The fish are basically they're reaching that big size. They reach that relatively early on in life, like around age 15 to 20 or so. But then they're basically sitting on what's called an asymptote for all those decades later, just growing very minimally in their body size. We found they were only growing at a rate of 1 millimeter per year from age 50 to 100. And this was significant in both sexes for Ice Lake population. So they're still technically growing in total length. What we found is it's 1 millimeter per year, but in any given age, you can have incredible size variation. So there could be a 40-pound female that's 80. You could also have a 17-pound female that's 80 years old, and you could have any range of sizes in between. So it's really, I think, fascinating. And one of the aspects I should add is that the the thing that is increasing disproportionately or increasing more than you would expect with each unit increase in size is their investment in their reproductive tissue. So they're actually putting more into reproduction as they get bigger than you would expect just by their size increase alone. And it shows, again, the value of the adults in the population and how the species evolve. Like they have an adaptive value of getting bigger and getting older. And then being around for when that time happens, where like there's big floods in the spring, whatever, and then there's a big cohort that may be the next generation that lasts for 100 years.
okay, yeah. So bring this back to the conservation status. We didn't talk about it in this conversation, but in the paper, you say how they're spawning in the Rice Lake, but then they don't make it out. So, have this like really old population of fish that hasn't reproduced successfully in a really long time. You talk about how one of the threats is that there's a lot more bow fishing than there used to be. And so that could be a conservation concern. And especially now that you're talking about how like the older fish are really valuable for keeping the population alive because they put in a lot of effort into reproducing successfully. Like, how do those two things like interact? Like how,
Yes.
because you have this old population and people are, killing essentially like 80-year-old fish and, how many more of them can there be? So can you talk a little bit about how that plays into the conservation issue?
Yeah, there's definitely reason for conservation concern. And I think the bottom line is a precautionary approach is necessary. And as many listeners probably know, the state of Minnesota has actively like been looking at addressing some of these concerns about some of these um, species that were just for many years just called rough fish and cast aside as inconsequential. Like there's no value to these species is what the common paradigm was. Well, with a modern understanding of ecology or even just a basic understanding of ecology, we know that native members of an ecosystem have a role to play and they support all the other native members of an ecosystem. So we have these species that are interwoven together in what's called an ecosystem, and they all play off in value from each other. So that's where it is concerning in the sense that because this species has been written off as rough fish for so long, it's really difficult to understand like what is their population size? How many are there? How many are being taken? Like over since the water control structures were built in this system in particular, like that was built in the 50s and then remodified in the late 1970s. So at that point, there was the beginning probably of the more people focusing on targeting them because there was that pinch point that was there, which wasn't there previously. So since that time, there hasn't really been much recruitment. And how many have been removed from the system? How does the current population size compare to what it was long ago? We just don't know. So there's definitely a reason for concern. And I think that's where, for the benefit of all stakeholders in this, definitely we want to understand the things that we value. And with that understanding will come informed decisions and sustainability so that this amazing resource can be valued for generations to come. And because we obviously we wouldn't want to get in a situation where one day the species is just dwindled to essentially nothing in this system, and then everyone's like, "What happened to all the buffalo?" So,
Right, yeah. I mean, that'd be really sad.
but that's where, yeah, it's just like one of those things. Just remembering that these are a species. This is a species that's a co-inhabitant of the system of the refuge of Aiken County of Minnesota, and it has value. And another thing too is that the state of Minnesota is spending a lot of money trying to stop invasive carp from spreading northward.
Right.
And there aren't any invasive carp in that region of Aiken County or in the refuge in the Rice River system. Now, many people may think that, oh, the bigmouth buffalo, that, and they look one up, they'd be like, isn't that just a type of carp? No, it's not. They're a native species found in North America. To confuse a carp with a buffalo is like confusing a deer with a pig. They're that distantly related,
Wow.
but they have converged on a similar body shape in the fish example. But the thing is that the carp species, they spawn in a similar way and they occupy similar habitat. So by having a robust population of buffalo fish, the native member, you're actually making it more difficult for carp species to gain traction. So there's benefits there too in terms of slowing the spread of invasive species, uh, and more reason that you want to have robust, resilient native ecosystems around, and actually and understand them before like, oh shoot, they've dwindled down to this point of no return, and by the way, now there's invasive species coming in and they're gaining traction really easily. Yeah, again, why the precautionary approach is necessary, what that may mean, that's up for management to decide. But as we know, as there's been articles in the state or whatever about there's movements being taken to address this conservation issue because for so long this group and many others in this group have just been widely neglected.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because learning about this fish, it kind of makes me think about what it means to be responsible, stewards of the
Or
environment.
exactly, responsible steward.
Because if, no one had come along and kind of studied this fish, a lot of people would never have known about it. And we could have went on thinking that this is kind of an infinite resource, like so many other things that we do. If we didn't know this about buffalo fish 10 years ago and we do now, it kind of makes you think like how many other fish like this are out here, like how many other species are out here. It makes you think about questioning, our assumptions about what's valuable and what's not, and how treat everything with respect. I look at everything with curiosity, because otherwise you don't know what you're losing.
Exactly, yeah. It's about keeping an open mind, like just keeping an open mind in general and critically thinking about issues can help you to realize that there's a lot we still don't know, and yeah, we don't want to have prejudice against any one group of people or any one species or anything like that. It speaks to the value of having a holistic view and trying to keep an open mind. But I think too, like with the bigmouth buffalo, as you pretty much mentioned there, and we sort of conclude about this fact in the towards the end of the paper is that the bigmouth buffalo is testament to the many of the unsolved mysteries still of the natural world. Because here was a species that for so long was just put aside, but here we're finding so many fascinating things, and it makes you curious. What else might we not know that's still out there? Like, I think a lot of people in this day and age think that we know like these types of things extremely well by now with all technology and all these things, but actually there are still many unsolved mysteries in the natural world. One of which also pertains to the bigmouth buffalo and other buffalo fishes for that matter, is that we don't understand how they're still getting better with age at like 80 to 90 to 100 years old. They're still improving physiologically, getting better with their stress response, their immune function, and they're showing no signs of DNA damage or telomere shortening with age either. And basically, they defy typical aging things that vertebrates typically deal with. So what is it that they've got that makes them so special? We do not know. But what if this is something that could be of value to medicine and things like this species could really be a treasure for many different reasons.
Yeah, and I feel like that's really exciting. How much we're learning about them and how quickly, but it makes it even more sad. The fact that they're in trouble. Like, and kind of shows how fragile, I mean, you look at a lake and you think it's always going to be there, but it shows you kind of how fragile like all the inhabitants of the lake and all the fish and all the plants and how the whole ecosystem is kind of, you don't really know how it's all tied together until you.
Yeah, and that brings up, yeah, the fragility of how fragile it is important too, because a part of the paper that we document too is that or that's clear, like the water control measures the stabilizing of water levels that may be exacerbating or making worse the gaps that are found in some populations of bigmouth buffalo. We don't know this definitively because it's just correlative evidence. You can't actually pin down the causal link with just correlative evidence, but um, it has shown up in multiple systems now where at the advent or introduction of dams or water control structures, then after that point, recruitment success became less frequent. And this was like statistically significant in this aspect too. So it's like the bigmouth buffalo is it can be considered what's called a sentinel species. It can give us an indication of a broader view, a broader understanding of sort of the health of a given ecosystem because they can live so long and we can see back so far
Right.
using their age distribution. So if like more than 80% of the fish in the Rice River population hatched prior to the water control structure being even constructed in the first place, and only 17% hatched after the water control structure, it might be that this water control structure, even though it may benefit other aspects of the ecosystem, it may actually be affecting other species in their ability to successfully spawn and have offspring make it through. But that's, again, we don't know if that's like a definitive link, but it definitely makes you want to understand those mechanisms more because it just speaks to how fragile, if you start manipulating variables, you can have cascading effects.
So we covered a lot of ground and we only have like a couple of minutes left of our time. So just to recap, we've talked about the bigmouth buffalo, this amazing fish that can live for over 100 years, and this really old population right here in Aiken County that's really special and worth preserving, and also about how, unfortunately, like the kind of the attitudes that we have here and that the DNR has towards the buffalo fish.
There's definitely concern, but I would like to add that the DNR has changed its narrative about these species. They are making efforts to change this, and I think like they're maybe not able to comment or whatever on all of the aspects all at once, but I think there's a lot of work in progress being done because there is that understanding that holistic view of ecosystems is important and it's really well known. So I think, yeah, the historic issue was definitely a problem, but I think there's reason for optimism in the future here because I think Minnesota is actually leading the country, so to speak, with regard to addressing this sort of prejudice that was there regarding these species. So definitely
Could end on a high note then. That's
yeah.
exciting. And we're at the end of our time, so thank you so much, Alec.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me, and I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you for listening to the second episode of the Aiken County Soil and Water Conservation District podcast. If you want to learn more about Dr. Lackmann's study, the University of Minnesota Duluth News did a fantastic summary called Research Brief, 50-Year Generation Gap in Minnesota's Longest Lived Fish. You can find it on the UMD News website, and the original article is published in Scientific Reports. That is called Analysis of Bigmouth Buffalo Spawning Phenology in Minnesota Reveals 50-Year Recruitment Failure and Conservation Concern. And finally, as always, visit the new Soil and Water website at aikencounty.swcd.org to learn more about our programs and events.